Hey everybody. I am super excited about our topic today, and I feel like all of you are super excited because you chose to come to this presentation. So I feel like you made a great decision. We're going to have a lot of fun. I hope you like Back to the Future because there's going to be a lot of Back to the Future puns in this presentation.
Yeah, you'll be sick of them by the end, I'm sure. I met Nicole, and this is relevant because you probably heard product marketing in my title and your eyes started to roll. I met her at a threat intelligence company back in 2020 when initial access brokers were the thing. People selling domain admin, access to email accounts across the dark web, and it was all very exciting at the time. So we spoke a lot about that at the time. Fast forward then, we then found ourselves at the same company at Cisco, where we were in the worlds of identity. And it appeared there was a huge opportunity of can we use those lessons and how can we improve the world of threat intelligence with respect to identity. So that's where we met, and that's where the idea for this presentation came.
Yes, but we are by no means identity experts, but we have done a lot of preparation for this presentation, and we are very aware of how attackers are targeting identity. So in that aspect, we have a lot of knowledge. So it's gonna be a pretty good time. Disclaimer, nobody cares. October 2023, Okta had a significant data breach. And what happened was attackers were able to compromise the credentials of an employee. And then with that access, they were able to hijack a service account, and that service account had access to their customer support channels. And the issue is that those customer support channels had a lot of files that they used to help customers with like debugging and troubleshooting, such as HAR files, which are HTTP archive files. And those are basically files that capture information that travel between the browser and the websites that you're trying to connect to. The other issue is that those can contain everything an attacker needs to complete session hijacking. They don't need credentials. They don't need, if the account has MFA, they can just bypass it. So it was a huge deal. It was very significant because of the number of customers impacted. But this can happen to any of us. It's not something that just happens to Okta. Any of us could be impacted by this because they're targeting the identity. They're not targeting, opportunistically vulnerabilities as much as they used to. And we could have chose any breach to talk about today, but the reason why we really wanted to highlight this breach is because it was something so simple, just, compromised credentials that started this whole chain of events. And I feel like Okta did a really great job of educating people about the potential impact of what could happen. And that's why we chose this for our presentation. But once again, we have to make sure we know that this could happen to any of us. None of us are immune to this type of attack.
I do feel that when APT29 does any attack type, it will become sexy. And I don't know if anybody saw, in February, the CISA put out an advisory about APT29, insert the reference, Cozy Bear, whatever your favorite nomenclature is, that they started doing initial cloud access techniques. And there's a bunch of this in there, and you should definitely go and give it a read after this. There were two highlights for me. One was continued attempts at MFA fatigue, so those attacks that you just email and push bombing and notifications in the hope that somebody will accept one. But the second one was around the targeting of service accounts again and dormant accounts. And this is something that we've seen quite a lot recently, but also going back a few years. You can actually go back to August 2022 when APT29 started targeting these dormant accounts. Those are those accounts that somebody's left the company and definitely somebody should have disabled or deleted that account, but it's remained there inactive, just kind of sitting there with all the permissions. And so obviously they're not as well monitored, and groups like APT29 are well aware of that. But it's not just these nation-state affiliated actors. You've also got cyber criminals getting on in the action. You've got folks like the Tycoon Fish Kit, which have probably towards the middle of last year, introduced the ability to have the session hijacking and the cookies within the fish kit, the ability to capture that information. So there's been a ton of stuff that's happened dating back all of this way, and I think we probably all know that these aren't exhaustive. Identity attacks are happening every day.
Yeah, and I feel like before we get into this slide, I will say a lot of times people don't care about certain attacks until someone like an APT, uses it. But if you think about realistically, who's going to target your organization? It's most likely going to be the cybercrime actors, not the APTs. So we shouldn't wait till someone, super spicy decides to use it. We need to be paying attention when anyone's using it. So once again, I am super excited that you guys came today. I feel like there was a lot of great choices this morning, and so I'm so thankful that you came. I'm going to do a little show of hands. If anyone in the room works in cyber threat intelligence or CTI, could you raise your hand? Woo, my people. So for you guys today, what you can expect from this presentation, really just a brief crash course in like everything identity, just an overview of the whole threat landscape, some specific identity attacks, some predictions and things like that. Anyone in the room work in security operations in any sort of form? Woo! So you guys really, lots of MFA. I will say, if you get anything from this presentation, I hope that you remember MFA in all its glory. The other thing I want to say, it's not something just security operations, but also CTI is a little guilty of this too, is this kind of obsession with Active Directory attacks and less of an obsession with identity. So we're going to try to sway you to pay attention to both today. And then also the importance of that joiner, mover, leaver process of recognizing those dormant accounts and things like that.
All right, I'm expecting a huge swell of identity. So hands for who's in identity here. It's like 50%. Good job. So the key takeaways, and hopefully by the end you'll all be aware of this, is to really ram into our heads that threat intelligence doesn't equal indicators of compromise. It's different from TTPs. And knowing this and using understanding of the language around threat intelligence professionals will provide a real way to leverage their capabilities that I think will really power up identity controls, and I think there's a huge opportunity there. So that's for you identity folks. And then if you're not in any of these categories and you've just wandered in because you're passionate about intel-driven identity threat detection, then we've got some stuff for you as well. We've got the ability to know what weak MFA is and the implications of that. We've also got the importance of identity. So I think before you had the idea of over-permissioning that everybody really knew about, and they knew there were problems there, but the business didn't really care. Now, when we're doing things like people trying to adopt Microsoft Copilot, they can't do that because they know it's just a mess with their permissions. So I think identity has really been elevated to a pretty important business level. And then finally, we've got some tenuous Back to the Future references. So if all else fails, you can make use of those.
And please feel free to take pictures of anything during the presentation.
For copyright reasons, we couldn't use Back to the Future images, so we used ChatGPT for this. But this, I wanted to start off with just a level set on identity. Again, Nicole mentioned that we're not experts in identity, and I spent about a year working in identity. So I was trying to learn what's going on, and this is basically my dummy's guide to identity for folks in the room, for the 50% of you that aren't in identity. For those of you who are, feel free to disagree, heckle, throw things at me. I really love identity, but even more than that, I love ice cream. And that got me thinking, what are the similarities between ice cream and identity? Bear with me here. It's slightly tenuous, but we'll get there. Okay, first of all, identity comes in many flavors. There is chocolate chip, which is the best. Some are better than others, but there's a huge range of flavors, and that's just like identity. You've got user accounts, service accounts, machine accounts. You've then got different levels of accounts. You've got the ones with high permissions, those privileged access, and we need to be thinking about really protecting those at all times. It's easy to get bloated. You get loads of ice cream, and you can build it all up. It's delicious. They do really awesome things, but you'll be sorry that you had too many of them. Back, like 5 years ago, there were a handful of ice cream vendors that were really good. You had Haagen-Dazs, Ben & Jerry's. Now, if you go to any city, there's like 5 to 10 incredible craft ice creameries. And that's just like identity. It's no longer just about Active Directory, which was the only show in town. You've now got identity living in all tools. It's kind of this huge ecosystem of identity that makes it quite complex to track. And if you've got any kids like me, or you're just a messy adult, cleaning it up really sucks. People know this. They have been sweeping stuff under the carpet for many years when it comes to identity, whether that's dormant accounts, contractor accounts, just bad hygiene. We know it's a problem, but nobody really wants to go and do anything about it. So let's pass it on to the next person. Don't clean up that ice cream. So if you consider all of that, why are we where we are? Why have we not been able to get our hands around the identity problem? First of all, it has evolved because of the increase in vendors, increase in number of accounts. That bloat has meant that it's evolved quicker than realistically security's understanding of what identity is and that joiner mover leaver process. Second, it's a mess, and attackers like APT29, like everybody else, are loving all of the holes in the identity infrastructure. Poor hygiene does hinder business goals. You can't do stuff if you're too concerned that people have too much access. And finally, efforts to do anything about this are still incredibly siloed. People aren't speaking to each other enough. Ergo, identity needs to chat to threat intelligence a bit more than they are. So 1 to 2 years ago, we all got incredibly excited about the idea of moving security operations and identity together. And that's where we got identity threat detection and response. The idea of, can we bring security and identity together so that all the cool detections they're doing in the SOC, we can now add identity to that. And that's really cool, right? We can just go and do that, and all of a sudden we'll have all of the identity stuff detected. Gartner also got really excited about it. They were saying that in a couple of years, 90% of organizations are going to have an ITDR capability, and that's going to solve this identity threat landscape that's emerging. Of course, it's a lot more complicated than that. Security teams often are already looking at things like Active Directory, and so that's kind of their gaze and where they're looking at. If they are including things from cloud identity providers, like Okta or Microsoft, often they don't, it's really, really tricky to know what to do with that in the SIM. So even the folks that are taking in this data, they're not doing that much with it because it's a complex area, and we don't know how to build detections for things like dormant accounts and when they come back alive. So it hasn't matured as much as we'd have liked to have seen in the past few years. Look at that. Nicole.
So before we go into identity attacks, I really want to share some of the things that I've learned after digging into identity, just some basic hygiene. And I'm not going to go through all of them because I hate reading slides when I give presentations, but I am going to go through a few of them that I'm going to discuss throughout the presentation. Number one, implement MFA, please. But don't rely on weaker MFA. And there's a lot of controversy as to what does that mean, weak MFA? I'm not going to answer that today. I will give some advice along the way, but I'm not going to give my absolute, because it's controversial. Everyone thinks it's different. But I will say SMS, MFA, probably not the best. Implement least privilege. Make sure everyone only has access to what they absolutely need, but don't assume trust. And I always hear this all the time, don't assume trust. And I'm like, what does that mean? Well, in CTI, we have this thing where we say, if we read something in a blog, we always assume trust, but verify. We always trust, but verify. So if someone comes to you and says, hey, I just got promoted and I need access to something now that only managers have access to. You could trust that they're saying the truth, but you should verify it because you never know, what people, are thinking. If someone decides, hey, I just want to bring my my home laptop to work one day, connected to the network, you could trust that they're, a nice employee and stuff. But like our home networks are like a war zone, so maybe not. So when I say assume trust, I would just say trust but verify. Always verify that people are doing and what they're supposed to be doing and saying what they're supposed to be saying. Delete dormant accounts. We're probably going to say this a lot throughout the presentation because we've seen them targeted a lot in incident response cases. But don't forget those vendor, contractor accounts, service accounts. All of those should be included when you're auditing your accounts and looking for things. Don't forget those because these might not be the first accounts targeted, but a lot of times these are like high risk, high impact accounts that attackers will be trying to access because a lot of times they have really lackadaisical security controls, so they can just blend right in a lot of times. So definitely don't forget those throughout your auditing process. So I am on the Cisco Talos team. I'm on the threat intelligence and interdiction team at Talos. One of the responsibilities of our team is providing intelligence support to the Talos incident response team. So I'm going to go over the top identity attacks that the Cisco Talos incident response team has seen over the last 2 years. And if you're wondering, why would you go back 2 years and not just go over the last year? We really wanted to show that this has been a problem for a long time, and it's only getting worse quarter after quarter. Phishing, I'm shocked. As long as we use email, we're gonna have phishing. It's not a surprise at all that phishing was the top threat in 2022. It's going to continue to be a top identity attack year after year, unless we decide we don't want to use email anymore. Account takeover, this is really anytime a valid account was accessed and compromised by an attacker. I have it included in this. This could be from compromised credentials, business email compromise. All of them are just pushed right into that. So we did start seeing a lot of account takeovers, and this could be anywhere in the attack chain, not necessarily initial access. It could be something that happened in the middle. An insider threat is something, I feel like it's a very uncomfortable topic for anyone, but it's very important. And if you've ever seen any of my presentations, I always say that it's something that we always need to think about. And when we're in an incident response case, we always need to think, 50%, maybe it's someone with external knowledge of the inner workings of the organization, but what if it's someone inside? So not necessarily thinking that anyone's doing something that they shouldn't be, but you should keep it on your mind that that is definitely a possibility. And then we started seeing MFA exhaustion attacks. You might know this as MFA fatigue. And these are basically when attackers have compromised credentials and they try to log into accounts that are protected with MFA, and they will usually log in several times, which causes a flood of these push notifications, and they hope that if they just overwhelm the victim, they'll just accept it and grant them access. This does not always take a flood. Sometimes it's just one push notification. But we like to say that it's it's bigger than it is because it makes it sound like the person was overwhelmed, but that's not always the case. But pay attention to this number because it is going to increase significantly as we move forward.
I like the story of, I think one attack had a strategically timed one, which is somebody in the middle of the night, if you just hammer them with MFA pushes, and they're just like, shut up, I'll do whatever to get that off.
So in 2023, account takeover took the top spot for the top identity attack that we saw. Phishing, obviously it's still going to be there. It's not the top, but again, we're not going to get rid of phishing. It's going to stay there. But notice, MFA exhaustion increased. This number actually tripled from what we saw in 2022. And MFA exhaustion attacks go hand in hand with account takeover. So the account takeover was actually a 43% increase, and that goes hand in hand with that MFA exhaustion. Phishing was a 22% increase, but again, we're going to keep seeing that, or decrease, sorry, 22% decrease. But no matter what, if phishing goes up and down, I think it's just going to stay. An insider threat, again, that's something that we're going to continue to see. It might be an uncomfortable topic, but we do need to know how to respond to it. So in 2023, we saw a 95% increase in the ransomware attacks that we responded to that were caused by identity attacks. And that is significant to me. But if you don't like ransomware, if you've heard ransomware too much and you don't like that, I have another statistic for you. So as you know, in incident response, sometimes you don't know what the initial access is. Sometimes they don't have significant logging, or they don't have retention, or we just don't have enough visibility in the environment to figure out what it is, or confirm it with confidence. But in the cases in 2022 and 2023 where we were able to identify it, I looked at all of the initial access vectors each quarter and added them up. 60% both years, like altogether, were identity attacks. So this is something that is critical that we need to be paying attention to, because it means that threat actors aren't just targeting vulnerabilities, opportunistically as much. They still are, it's still a thing, but not as significant as these identity attacks, and we need to be paying attention as we move forward. And we need to keep evolving with them so that we can protect ourselves. So MFA is something that actually inspired this presentation. When Mike came to me and said, hey, do you want to present on identity? I was like, yes, please. Because one of my responsibilities is I write the quarterly incident response trends blog each quarter, and quarter after quarter for the last year, looking back before I was there, a year before, a lack of MFA implementation is the top security weakness quarter after quarter. It's always MFA. And it's to the point where I'm a little tired of writing about it. But I will say that in the first quarter of 2024, the top security weakness that we saw was actually not a lack of MFA, but users accepting unauthorized push notifications. So I feel like that's a good thing. Like, at least maybe we're moving the security pendulum in the right direction, but we still have a lot of work to do. Right underneath unauthorized push notifications was, of course, a lack of MFA. So it's still there, but I feel like we are moving in a good direction.
So that's the threat landscape. Hope you're all agreed that identity attacks are swelling, it's happening, all of the great stuff that Nicole has been tracking. How can we then go and build something that can do a better job of identifying some of these threats than perhaps we've been doing at the moment? So here is another phenomenal AI-generated image to show the flux capacitor.
It kind of reminds me, has anyone seen the movie Ready Player One? It kind of reminds me of the H's warehouse where he builds the Iron Giant. This is one of my favorite AI images. I just always think of Ready Player One.
So the idea here is, can we create an identity threat detection model that includes cyber threat intelligence more than we're doing at the moment? And importantly, what would that look like? How can we equip, whether it's threat intelligence teams, security teams, or threat intelligence teams, with what they need to make that a reality?
But how dare you reveal it before it's revealed? If we're going to talk about CTI, we have to talk about some best practices. We have to talk about what is CTI, what is not CTI. So if we're going to do that, we should probably start talking about frameworks. And one of the frameworks that goes hand in hand with CTI is the Pyramid of Pain by David Bianco. And one of my favorite hobbies is just remixing this. If you saw my AttackCon presentation last fall, you might have seen the Pirate Ship of Pain. But today, I am here to present the DeLorean of Despair. With amazing quote by David Bianco, where we're going, we don't need IOCs, which is so perfect to the Pyramid of Pain. If you're not familiar with it, basically states that, think of it like a pyramid. It's funner as a DeLorean. But if you were to think of it like a pyramid, the bottom of the pyramid, is a lot larger than the top of the pyramid. Things like IOCs, domain names, hash values, these are all trivial for attackers to change. They can change them all the time. An IP that's hosting malware today might not be hosting malware tomorrow. But things like tools and behavior is very hard to change. Like if you think of like the way that you do your job, if you were to move jobs, you might change it a little bit, but for the most part, you've developed a method that you use. Attackers are the same way. So part of CTI is not focusing on things like IOCs. Sometimes they are important, but they need that extra context because that's where the value is going to be.
So if it's one thing you take away from what I've said, is if you're in identity, if you're in security, and you go to threat intelligence professionals and say, give me bad IP addresses, that's not the way to get them on side. They will hate you.
But if you say, what do you know about this IP address? That's a nice little Tuesday for me. I love that.
So really, really quickly, a quick maturity idea of what we've seen people doing if they've tried to build out identity threat detection capabilities. Most people are probably at 0. They're not doing a bunch of stuff here. They may be getting some sort of feeds from somewhere. But if you start to move to level 1, you've built Active Directory detections. You might be throwing in some of the feeds from an IDP. So Microsoft and Okta have got some pretty good initial feeds for understanding things like impossible travel, so on and so forth. Then you see organizations developing their own detections. So what can we do within a SIM to actually go and detect something that's more impactful? So maybe you are saying, oh, that's great, I've got this from Microsoft, but what have I also observed, and I could correlate that together. They then start to normally focus on these 2 areas, so account probing and impossible travel. For some security folks, impossible travel is a bit of a dirty word because it can be quite hard to get that in high fidelity. And finally, I think where it would be awesome to get to is, can you make that more preventative, more proactive? Can you start combining not even just event-driven detections, but can you combine that with entitlements? Can you combine that with that static information? The example and why we've blabbed on about it so much is dormant accounts. You're not just going to understand the context of a dormant account becoming active again if you're just looking at detecting an event. You need to have the context of when that person, say, was meant to have left, or how long has it been inactive for, and then combine that with some of the other more IP-driven detections. And fundamentally, it needs more input from the cyber threat intelligence team. It needs an insight into some of those TTPs, the tactics, techniques, that cloud initial access. What are some of the cyber criminals and nation-state actors doing now to get into these accounts, and help that to drive some of the detections and some of the proactive remediations that are going on.
So CTI is not IOCs. However, CTI can come with IOCs. IOCs by themselves lack context, and actionable intelligence really provides stakeholders to make informed decisions because it provides that context. So if I were to say, here's an IP address, and it was hosting, Cobalt Strike beacon, or it is a Cobalt Strike C2. The way you react to that is going to be a lot different than if I were to say, hey, this was, hosting Quackbot 3 months ago. Because something that's hosting Quackbot today might not be hosting Quackbot tomorrow. So they also have to be very timely. So if you get IOCs and you're not sure, like, when was this bad, that's an issue. So you have to have all of that context. And so when you work with CTI teams, they try to provide you with as much context as possible so that you can make a decision on how to react to that. Because if you were to see this in your environment, you would know, okay, if it was a Cobalt Strike, maybe I need to start doing like pre-ransomware type investigation. It's going to change significantly. So when we work together, multiple times, but one of the last times we worked together, we were really on the front lines of when vulnerability intelligence became a thing. And previous to this, I had known about vulnerabilities and written recommendations for clients saying, maybe just patch this, but it really wasn't in depth. I wasn't looking at, what is this vulnerability? What could happen if someone could exploit it? And providing them all of that extra context. And what I've learned digging into vulnerability intelligence at the time was that they didn't have a lot of time to research things because they have so many vulnerabilities that they have to look at. They needed just to know right away, is there a workaround? What can I do? I need to test this. Because then I learned you can't even just patch things sometimes. You have to test it in a test environment to make sure it's not going to break everything in security operations. So when vulnerability intelligence became a thing, that was really great, not only for vulnerability management teams, but also for CTI teams, because we were able to educate ourselves a lot. Because security operations doesn't always have a lot of time to research things, but do you know who does have a lot of time? CTI analysts have a lot of time. And if you are unsure if identity can have the same benefit as intel as vulnerability, I feel like this is a great example, because if you're looking into a vulnerability and I'm the CTI analyst helping you, I can tell you what is the vulnerability, what tool is it going to impact, what does that tool use, why do you use that tool in your environment? If they were to exploit it, what then is going to happen? Is it being exploited? Do they have to daisy chain vulnerabilities to exploit it? Is there a POC? All of this context, I can tell you if there's a workaround. Has anyone complained that the workaround doesn't work? So it's just so much context to save you time. And that's really what vulnerability intelligence did. And I feel like we're at that point now where we can do the same thing for identity.
So let's get into it, and we're going to try and provide a bit of an overview of threat intelligence and map what you can do, particularly as identity folks, to understand that better and work more with your threat intelligence team. And to do that, we've got the trusty intelligence cycle. There are many intelligence cycles, this is one of them, but it's a really good way of methodically understanding how threat intelligence professionals work. This, going through each of these steps, will help produce some really powerful finished intelligence that is tailored to the business goals. Me and Nicole were fighting over which is the most important stage of this, and my favorite one is planning and direction. So at this stage, it's all about how do I ask the best possible questions so that when I ask the threat intelligence team, I'm incredibly specific. So we've all played around with, say, ChatGPT, garbage in, garbage out. You need to be really, really specific about what you want. So if you say to somebody, are people attacking identity? And you give that as a requirement for your threat intelligence team, you're going to get a generic answer back. So I've provided a few examples of some ways you can give an intelligence requirement to the threat intelligence team, but just be as specific as possible, and I think that will kick off the cycle in the best possible way. I'll flash up some further examples, and obviously these will be on the slides of the examples of priority intelligence requirements. The next step is to then go and collect the stuff, collect the information on events, attempted logins, entitlements, so on and so forth. We know we're probably collecting a bunch of this already, and predominantly that's Active Directory, but I've listed a bunch of other sources we need to be thinking about. Those include identity providers themselves, but realistically, you've got all of these other tools, AWS, even things like Salesforce, where identity information is living. And so if you want to do a really good job of detecting bad things, you need to be looking at all of these sources. So for the identity people in here, you're probably already aware of that. But you also need to be thinking about external data sources. So can I collect information from exposed credentials that can be tailored in to some of my detections and provide a bit of additional context? There's also a bunch of incredible intelligence on initial access broker marketplaces. Those actors that are selling logins to specific individuals that have access to, in turn, corporate accounts. So we may right now be looking at IP-driven detections, but if we can start to do that across other sources and then correlate that with external sources, I think we'll be in a really, really powerful position.
And the processing stage is super important. Really, I utilize this stage in anything I do in security operations, when it's CTI, threat hunting, incident response. When I'm looking at a data set, I want to make sure I have the most complete data set. I want to make sure that I'm normalizing the data. I'm not looking at a bunch of duplicates. I'm looking at the quality of the data, because if I am pulling in a bunch of different, let's say someone has, in the logs, US, and then someone has United States, and then someone has U.S, and I'm going to query that, and I only know about one of them. It's not going to be a full data set. So the processing stage is really important. And this is also, I've seen, digging into identity, I've seen that identity teams do a lot of like imports and integrations. And during those times, there could be some issues with mapping. And if it's not mapped correctly, the access technically shouldn't work. But what happens is a lot of times they will supply like workarounds so that business operations continue to operate. But those workarounds sometimes can introduce new security risks. And they make exceptions here and exceptions there. So if you're gonna have an intel-driven process, when you're in this stage, you really wanna start identifying those pain points, hopefully mitigating them, but at the least just identifying them. Analysis, I feel like is my favorite stage. I won't say probably it's the most important stage, but it is the funnest stage. This is where you're just exploring the data set that you have. You're starting to put the pieces together. You start looking for any type of context that you can have, any type of patterns. You start pivoting on information. And what I mean by pivoting is like if an endpoint in your environment was like beaconing out to an IP. Like I said earlier, if that's like a crypto miner, it's gonna look a lot different of an investigation than if it's like ransomware. If it was like a known ransomware C2 or a Cobalt Strike C2, you're gonna immediately pivot your investigation and start looking for that. So that's what I mean by pivot. And you might be thinking, oh, this is something that security operations does. This is not something I do on identity. But I feel like security shouldn't just land on the security team. I feel like it should permeate throughout the organization. And I feel like there's a lot of times, at least at Cisco, that like identity people will identify trends that are super useful. So I feel like we all need to start adopting that adversarial mindset. So we wanted to give some examples of if you're looking for analysis and you're looking for, or in the analysis stage, you start looking for something, you see something, and what could be recommendations for like actionable intelligence, or if you're working with a CTI team. So things like session hijacking, we talked about that with the Okta breach. You might do things like reduce the session length and timeout period. And one of the great things about that is like that extra context is like, if you know an attack happens, but you're not sure on prevention, for me at least, I just go talk to identity teams because they know the tools in and out. So that's that extra collaboration. Even when I was preparing for this presentation, I talked to so many identity folks just to make sure. I was like, does this, this look right? But the same thing with vulnerability intelligence. I would have never had such great recommendations as I do now. I used to just be like, patch this. And that's not a good recommendation, because everyone's environment is different, but I didn't know that at the time because I don't have a history of security operations. So working with CTI could be super beneficial and save you time. So dissemination, I would say, is the most important stage because although the other parts of the intelligence cycle are educational if you go through them, it doesn't really mean anything unless you are able to talk about what you saw. If you are in incident response, and you're going through a case and you see all this stuff, that's great, but you have to be able to tell someone about it. And this doesn't always have to be a super formal report. It doesn't have to be a long report. It doesn't even have to be a report. It could just be that you go up to your manager and tell them. As long as that communication is happening, it could be a meeting, could be an email, could just be like a Slack, WebEx, Teams, whatever you like to use. It doesn't have to be super formal, but notice I did add that security operations and CTI on the list because it's great to have that back and forth collaboration. If identity tells me something and says, hey, what do you know about this? I will then make sure I tell them, what we found, or if I ask them something, hey, can you look into this? Is this something that you're seeing as a trend? Having them talk back to me and say like, that actually was a trend, and like, thanks for pointing it out, because that's how everyone's gonna learn in the situation. So definitely we wanna, if you take away anything, just lots of collaboration. So we can't have a Back to the Future theme talk without talking about what's next for the future of identity intelligence. So looking at the attacks that I saw within the last 2 years, there were some things that I've noticed that I think that we need to be paying attention to moving forward. Phishing, obviously, is one of those that we need to be paying attention to. Specifically, the adversary in the middle phishing, that's where it's similar to adversary in the middle by itself, but it just starts with a phishing link. They're forwarding, credentials or session tokens to a legitimate site. That's something that we need to be paying attention to, and it's something as a CTI analyst, I feel like it's very challenging to write recommendations for. So if you have recommendations on how to prevent that or things, please tell me, because it's challenging. Identity is hard, and I get it now. MFA exhaustion attacks, this is super important. I feel like we really need to make sure we're updating our security awareness training so that your employees know how to identify it and how to report it if this happens, because that knowledge is going to be half the battle with that. And then insider threat, of course, we're going to have to keep talking about that. We're going to have to keep normalizing that topic. And then privileged and service account, this also includes vendor, contractor accounts, all of these accounts. We need to make sure if we're talking about security, we're talking about all of these accounts, not just user accounts, because these are those high-risk, high-impact accounts that may not be targeted first, but they're probably going to eventually be targeted. And like the ice cream, sometimes it really sucks to go back and fix it afterwards. I've heard that like a lot of these accounts, like trying to change their password or trying to implement security controls is awful. So try to have that at the beginning when you're implementing these.
And here, if you do want to start chatting to whether that's your internal threat intelligence team or you've got an external threat intelligence provider, here are those intelligence requirements that you can be looking to ask of your threat intelligence team. Tweak these, you each have your own priorities and what you care about, but this gives an idea of what would be the appropriate level of detail to ask of the threat intelligence team that may well provide you insight into perhaps a changing configuration you might need to make. So if attackers are targeting a bunch of accounts with session hijacking in one particular IDP because they're making use of a particularly lax policy that has a session length enabled, you really need to go and then focus on changing that policy and making sure that the defaults are in the right place, as an example. So that would be a great way to get intelligence from that team. But I won't read through all of these. You can take a picture if you like. And then I think just generally as an industry, we can do more to mature, and I think we will do that. If you look at the MITRE attack techniques for identity, they are still very, very Active Directory driven. And we've seen this year, previous years, that is definitely becoming that cloud initial access now. And I think there could probably be an added level of rigor in some of those techniques that we're looking at, and particularly some of the actionable intelligence that we're providing for those, that we can go a bit of a step further. And if we work with each other and identity teams get closer to the threat intelligence teams, I think that genuinely can become something that's pretty awesome. So that's it. That's about it. We've got a couple of extra slides that we can pop up that were mandatory slides.
If you want, we did want to provide some recommendations. That 30, 60, 90-day policy is something I recently learned about that goes hand in hand with that joiner, mover, leaver process. Because apparently you can't just delete accounts immediately after someone leaves. There is a process in place for those, and there's like certain compliance things. But we do recommend reaching out, seeing if you have a CTI function, reaching out to a vendor if you want. There's also a lot of just communities like FS ISAC, all the ISACs and stuff. Those are really great. And just see what type of intelligence sharing you can get into if you're not up for going for the vendor route. But there's also a lot of great vendors out there. There's a lot of great communities. There's actually a lot of great like Discords and Slacks and things like that as well that I get a lot of great intelligence for. So definitely recommend that.
Yeah. And then there's some more actionable tips in the next 6 months as well. So there's a bunch of stuff in here. My highlight would be to focus on those, not just dormant accounts, but the contractor dormant accounts. So you have invited a bunch of third parties to your organization, they're no longer using it, just go and delete them. They don't need to be there. If somebody really wants access, they will let you know. So yeah, there's a few things to focus on here, and I think the crescendo, of course, is kicking off this process with the Cyber Threat Intelligence team. All right, thank you all very much. Thanks for being here. We really, really appreciate it. And if you have any questions, we'll stick around for about 5 more minutes or grab us at the end.
Thank you.